All right, tonight I want to go over a couple different things. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background material as we get started here. And then I want to talk just a little bit about long-term weather trends. I know it's been dry here. So these weather trends are long-term, not necessarily just 1 year. Talk a little bit about hay feeding approaches. And then we're going to talk about considerations for hay storage, and then feeding considerations, and kind of finish up with some questions and discussion. And again, if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to ask them. I wanted to start out with this diagram, and this shows cow-calf production costs, and I kind of put it in a pie chart. And the important thing that I want to show you is if we look at hay and feed, it makes up almost half of the cow-calf production budget. So it's a significant cost. Hay is an expensive part of cow-calf production. And it's kind of funny, a lot of people don't realize how big of a piece it makes up because we don't write one big check for hay. We write a bunch of small checks. We write a check for fertilizer, we write a check for fixing the baler, we write a check for twine and so on. But it really adds up, and when we look, this was a survey of 138 farms, and when we look at that, it makes up about half the budget for cow-calf production. So what's that tell us? If we want to be profitable in a cow-calf operation, there's kind of three ways we can do that, right? We can increase the price we get for our product, which would be a calf. Do we have a lot of control over that when we go to the stock market? Not a lot, right? I mean, we have some things we can do to add value to calves, but generally we're going to kind of take what they give us when we go to the livestock market. The second way we can do it is produce more units of that product. So if I have a product and I have kind of a profit margin on that product, if I want to make more overall money for the entire farm, I can produce more units of that product. And that would be our calves. But at some point we become land limited. There's only so many cows that our farm can hold sustainably. And the last one is that we can control our production cost. And probably of those three, the last one has the biggest potential for increasing profitability in cow-calf operations. And when we look at this chart, we need to go after the biggest piece of this pie. And that's going to be hay and feed in cow-calf operations. So anything that we can do to reduce that piece of the pie is going to increase the profitability of the operation. So when we move forward, we're going to talk about hay tonight, but what we really need to be thinking about is what can we do to better utilize hay within our system and to graze more days of the year. When cattle harvest their own feed, that's when we're going to be the most profitable. So this analysis of these 140 farms found that the average cost to produce a cow-calf unit in 2022 was $998. That's a pretty good chunk of money. Now, we're doing okay this year with 240 calves, right? Last week they were about 240 at the stock market. So we're making a little bit of money. But if we go 1 year back, 1 year from last week, they were about $1.65. $1.65 is break even on $998. So the point I'm making is that we need to control production costs to remain profitable, even in years when cattle prices are not high. This was something we recently got from our state statistician with the USDA. And it looks at hay production per beef cow in Kentucky. And it's kind of a disturbing trend for me as a forage specialist. From about the mid-1970s till last year, we saw a steady increase in the amount of hay that we're producing per beef cow in the state. So that means that we're consuming more hay in our systems. And remember, hay is something that's inversely, the amount of hay that we feed our cattle is inversely related to profitability. So that's a real challenge as we move forward. And why that increase in hay use? And this is kind of a summary by Daryl Peel from Oklahoma State University. They found the same trend in increased amount of hay per beef cattle unit used. And so Daryl kind of put together some thoughts. And one is that the cows are bigger, right? So that's 50 years ago, 1970. The cows were quite a bit smaller then. As we move forward, our size has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. What's the average weight of a cow now? Throw me a number out. 1350? Yeah, 1350, maybe 1400 in some cases. So they certainly have gotten bigger over the years, and as that cow gets bigger, she's going to consume more as a percent of her body weight. He thinks that accounts for about 20% of the increase that we've seen in the increased hay use. Increased waste in wasted hay. You know, we can push somewhere between 30 and 50% loss in storage and feeding for hay if we don't do a good job with those two things. And he feels that accounts for about 40% of the increase that we see in hay per cow. And the last one is a longer feeding period. He estimates that the feeding period is increased by 30 to 40 days. It kind of makes me feel bad as a forage specialist because I want you guys to graze more and feed less hay. And here we are looking at a month longer feeding period. And I've got to ask myself why that's happening. And one reason that it may be happening is that if we're stocked at a similar rate on our farm, so say we have 10 cows in 1970 and we've got 10 cows now, and all of a sudden the body weight is increased by 25 or 30%, you know, we're going to be at a higher effective stocking rate on that farm. So that could be one potential reason that we're seeing that increase. I want to share just a few slides on long-term weather trends with you. 2 years ago, Matt Dixon did he's our ag meteorologist, he did a really nice job summarizing long-term weather trends and implications for grazing operations in the Mid-South. And if you're interested in watching the whole presentation, it's available on our YouTube channel. I'll show you how to get there at the end of the presentation. But you can watch Matt's entire presentation. I just picked a few slides out to show you that were kind of interesting. The first one was Kentucky's top 10 wettest years on record. And it went from 1895 to 2020 was the data set. What was interesting was that 5 of the top 10 wettest years on record in Kentucky has been in the last decade. That's pretty amazing. I know it's dry now, but we're starting to see a little bit of an increase in precipitation. If we kind of divide this map into two, the eastern United States is generally seeing an increase in annual precipitation, somewhere in that 5 to 10% range. The western United States, unfortunately, and the Southwest especially, are seeing a decrease in precipitation. And these are our long-term weather trends. I don't know whether we're causing this change, mankind is causing this change, but I do know that we are starting to see different weather patterns in this part of the country. This is some interesting data, and I know it's small on the bottom, so I'll just tell you, this is the average frost-free period, and this was 1971 to 2000, and then the latest period is 1991 to 2020. We've seen an increase in the number of frost-free days somewhere between 5 and 14, depending where you're at in Kentucky. What's that mean? That means our growing season's getting longer. So we should be able to do an even better job extending our grazing season. So this is all interesting data. Now, make no mistake about it, just because we're seeing increasing trends in rainfall doesn't mean we're not going to have dry years. We're certainly going to have dry years scattered in there. That's kind of what an average is, right? So I had an economist at Virginia Tech used to say an average is kind of like having 2 buckets of water. one scalding hot, one ice cold. You put a foot in each one. He says on average you're comfortable, but it hurts like hell. And that's exactly what an average is. So I want to talk a little bit about approaches to hay feeding. And you all probably know that at the University of Kentucky we have kind of two camps right now on how we want to feed hay, right? And both of those camps are very passionate about how we should feed hay. And I want to talk kind of a little bit about those approaches and then kind of see, kind of where that truth really lies at. The first camp I call the stationary hay feeding. And what I mean by that is we feed hay in one location. This gives us ease of access, so if we're careful where we put our location at, we'll have a hardened lane, we can drive in there, we can drop a bale off into some type of hay feeding system like a fence line feeder or other system, and we'll have easy access. We localize damage during the winter months to kind of one part of the farm, right, because that's where they're going to disturb those soils at. Generally, these systems have some type of a hardened surface. Could be concrete, could be a geotextile with gravel or a geogrid or something, but some type of a hardened surface that helps reduce the amount of mud. But even when you have that hardened surface, when those cows step off of that surface into the pasture, you're going to have a foot of mud there, so that's just part of it when we feed hay. In this system, we've got to scrape and haul manure off of these pads maybe once or twice a year. We're going to tend to concentrate nutrients close to where we're feeding the hay at. So not just on the pad, but as we move away from that pad, we're going to tend to have a lot of dung and urine deposited there, and we're going to tend to concentrate the nutrients that were in that hay in those areas. And then it's a significant investment in infrastructure. So we kind of talked about profitability in cow-calf operations. We've really got to watch what we spend money on if we're going to remain profitable, especially when cattle prices dip a little bit lower. In making big investments in something like hay feeding structures and concrete and hardened surfaces and equipment to do hay feeding with, it's often hard for that brood cow to bear and remain profitable. So you have to be careful with your money. I'm not saying don't use these structures, but make sure that you sit down and really think about how much it's going to cost you and what you're going to gain from it. Are you going to gain an increase in profitability by putting one of these systems in? And if you're not, then you've got to ask yourself, why would I put one in? So I just want to remind everyone that every ton of hay that we produce or we buy in has about 35 pounds of nitrogen, 12 pounds of phosphorus, and about 55 pounds of K2O or potassium in it. If we assume the cost of the nutrients, and I got these prices recently, and they've really come down the last year, 50 cents for nitrogen, 45 for P2O5, and 50 cents for K2O, or potassium. Every ton of hay has about $50 worth of nutrients in it. Now, how we feed that hay is going to impact how much we get back in terms of those nutrients. If we feed that hay all in one spot, those nutrients are going to tend to be concentrated in that one spot. So, would you ever pull a fertilizer truck into a corner of the pasture, turn it on and dump all the fertilizer there? No, nobody would do that, right? Essentially, that's what's happening when we feed hay in one spot. Now, the second kind of camp that's on the opposite, so we've got the guys that over here that are feeding in one spot and with some type of hay feeding structure. And then we've got what I call, and I couldn't think of a better word than untethered, but the other guys that are kind of feeding hay in multiple spots. So they're moving that hay feeding around. We minimize damage to one area by keeping the point at which we're feeding the hay moving at a regular place. We're still going to have some disturbance in pastures. I mean, that's just part of it. If you're hay feeding, and even though you're moving that bale to another spot every time you feed, you're still going to have disturbance around that spot, especially if it rains when you're feeding. We get a better distribution of dung and urine, a much better distribution of dung and urine in this type of system where we're moving the feeding points around. We're really capturing the value of those nutrients that are in the hay. So when we buy that hay in or we make that hay, we're getting value, $50 of value back out of that bale. Not quite 50, it'd probably be about 2/3 to 3/4 of the nutrients we can kind of recapture. So we can use this in conjunction with stockpiling. So if we stockpile some fields and then we feed hay on those fields, that stockpile is normally higher than most of the hay that we're producing, so it can actually act as a supplement in our feeding system. So we'll feed that hay and then it'll have some good quality green stockpile to eat along with that hay. Generally a lower investment in infrastructure, so we're not pouring concrete, we're not building anything, we're not building a hay barn or a feeding barn or anything like that. We're just kind of using what we already have. So which one is right? And you know that it's just like anything, that the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, right? So not at either extreme, but kind of somewhere in the middle. It makes sense to me to feed hay on pastures that need some more fertility. So if I have some lower pastures that are lower in soil quality or soil fertility, that makes a good place to feed that hay on. And spreading those feeding points out allows you to capture those nutrients in that pasture. But it's also really nice to have some place to go when things get ugly. And that would be a hardened surface or a feeding barn. And I know there was a lot of dairies in this county at one time, maybe over 300 dairies in here. There's probably still some concrete out there from those dairies that would make a good winter feeding area if you needed some place to go. We need to work hard in our cow-calf systems to minimize large investments in infrastructure and equipment. If we're spending a lot of money on infrastructure and equipment, it's very hard to be profitable. So we have to really, really think about how we make those investments. I had a good friend in Virginia, Tim Sutphin, and he used to use what he called the 3-day rule. So when he thought he really needed something, I mean he really needed something, he would wait 3 days. And usually at the end of the 3rd day, he didn't need it as much as he thought. And that's probably not a bad rule to use when you're thinking about making investments in the farm. At the end of the day, there's no perfect way to feed hay. If someone tells you they've got the perfect solution for hay feeding, they may not be being completely truthful with you. It's not a perfect system, and it's not going to be a perfect system. It's up to us to kind of manage it as best as we can. So let's talk a little bit about some hay storage considerations. And when we talk about hay loss in grazing systems, it comes from 2 places, right? It comes from a loss during storage, and then we have to add the loss in during feeding. And that's our total loss for a hay feeding system. So let's start out with hay storage. And I always have questions when I drive around the countryside and I see hay bales like that. Tell me, how much did this guy pay to roll this hay up in terms of equipment cost? Was it more or less than a good quality hay that somebody put in a barn? It's exactly the same. That's right. You know, when I was growing up, we made small square bales, not a few, a whole mess of small square bales growing up. And I was always after my dad to get a round baler, which he didn't do until all the kids left the farm. But he would say, you know, when you make small square bales, you have a real respect for that hay. And there's a lot of truth to that. You know, there's a lot of truth to that. So when we look at a hay bale and it sits outside and it weathers, and we say we lose 4 inches of it, how much of the total bale is that outer 4 inches? It's more than we think in most cases. 25% on this particular bale was the outer 4 inches. And this just is a table that shows on a 4x5 bale, if we have 6 inches of weathering, we're losing about a third of the bale. Now the animals will eat some of that weathered hay, but a lot of it will be refusal when they eat that hay. So if we can store it and reduce the amount of weathering and loss that we have on the outside of that bale, we're going to go a long ways at stretching our hay source out. This is some work from Dr. Shiner's at the University of Missouri. And so these are 2 bales, and then he's got a twine wrapped one and then one on a pallet. So we broke ground contact. And the twine wrapped one, as you can see, wicked moisture up. We always think of moisture as coming down from the top on bales, and it certainly does, but a lot of the spoilage in a brown bale comes from the soil. It comes up and it gets wicked up into that bale. So if we can break ground contact, we're going to go a long ways at reducing hay losses in storage. This is twine wrapped and net wrapped. I was a little surprised on the net wrap. I thought we would have a little bit more moisture in the base of this bale than we actually do, but his research showed that we didn't. I've got another slide from another study in a minute that shows that we did have a little bit more with net wrapped. Usually net wrap, I kind of feel it holds the bale together better, but it doesn't really shed water per se because it's kind of porous. So this was a comparison of hay on a rock pad. So you made a rock pad with a railroad-sized rock compared to just setting it on the ground. So side by side, one on rock pad, one on the ground. What they found was that on the rock pad, you had 10% dry matter loss. We broke that ground contact, so the bale wasn't wicking moisture up. And then on the ground, we had 30% dry matter loss. So just by breaking that ground contact in this particular case, we reduced hay loss by about 20%. Now, where we store our hay, and we like to store it out of the way, right? We do it at the research station too, unfortunately, in some cases. We like to store it along the tree lines or in a little wooded area or whatever. That's not the best place to store it, right? Because they can't dry out. We want to get it away from trees. We want to make sure that's in open sunlight and that it can dry during the day or after a rain event. When we store hay in rows outside, we want the rows to run down the slope, and we want them not to be butted up against each other like in this picture, but to have 3 to 4 feet so it can shed water and then run down the slope. And that will help to preserve the hay. So more like this arrangement here. This one was a net wrap on the ground, and that's the publication that this data comes from the bottom. Net wrap on the ground had 23% dry matter loss compared to twine on the ground that had 30% dry matter loss. So there was certainly a difference, but not as big as you would think for the net wrap. This was the one that really amazed me. Anybody remember what an M&W baler was? Anybody ever remember seeing those? They were in Kentucky at one time in the 1990s. And they actually, instead of using net wrap or twine, they wrapped with plastic like this. And when you wrap that plastic around the bale, you're essentially doing 2 things. You're causing a surface that sheds water from the top, and you're breaking ground contact so it's not wicking water out from the bottom. And when you use this plastic wrap, we had 5% dry matter loss, same as compared to a conventional hay shed. So pretty amazing difference in terms of similarities in terms of dry matter loss when we broke the ground contact and shed water off these bales with a sheet of plastic around them. You know, if you're going to stack hay, and I drive through the countryside and I always see hay stacked up, not as covered as much as I would like, but if you're going to stack it, ideally especially in a pyramid, you really need to cover it with a hay tarp. And that always sounds like a great idea, right? But anybody that's messed with a hay tarp knows that it's just not a whole lot of fun to mess with a hay tarp and to keep it on the bales and to open it up and so forth. But if it's done correctly, and we're putting that hay onto a rock surface and then tarping it from the top, we can really reduce dry matter loss in that hay. This is just a diagram, and it's just showing some of the things that we talked about. So a rock pad to break ground contact, and then we've got 3 rows of hay here. We want to butt the bales up, ideally tightly together. We want 3 to 4 feet between rows of bales, and we want the bales to run down the slope so that water sheds down the slope. And then we want to be, of course, in a sunny spot, not a shady spot. And ideally a north-south orientation and on a south slope would be ideal. If we can do things like that, we're going to help to reduce hay losses when we're placing hay outside and not under cover. All right, I want to talk just a little bit about some hay feeding considerations. When we talk about feeding hay, quality matters. And not just because the hay is more nutrient dense for the animal, which is important for sure, but also it reduces refusal, right? If we've got a good quality hay that's palatable, animals are going to leave less of it when they're consuming that hay. And that means we're going to need less hay, and we're going to need less supplement because the hay is higher in nutrient density. So the best thing that we can do, it's hard to manage something if you don't measure it, right? So we can't manage hay and hay quality if we don't measure it. So I would encourage you to get a forage test on your hay just to kind of see where you're at. And when we sample hay, we have a nice publication on that. When we sample hay, we want to sample it in lots. And a lot is 1 cutting, 1 field. So if I have field A, cutting 1, that's a lot. If I have field A, cutting 2, that's a second lot. And we want to get the test back, and then we want to make sure that it's going to meet our nutrient requirements. And Nick can certainly help you do that. And then we have a really nice tool. It's called the UK Cow Forage Supplement Tool. We can put the results of our forage test in here, and it will tell us if we need supplement and how much supplement we need. It's not a ration balancer, but it's just to give you an idea whether you need to supplement that hay or not. And I always want to remind you, and I know you all know this, but there's lots of factors that impact forage quality. Fertilizer, forage species, whether it's a grass or legume, and the list goes on. But the single most important factor is cutting that hay on time. If we're cutting our hay closer to Independence Day than we are early May, then we're going to have lower quality hay. And that lower quality hay is going to be less palatable, and the animal's going to have higher amounts of refusal in that hay. So the single most important thing we can do to improve forage quality is cut the hay on time. For grasses, that means cutting at the late boot or early head stage. That's when that seed head is just coming out of that last leaf on the plant. For legumes like alfalfa, we want to be around 10% bloom. For red clover, about medium bloom. And if we do that, we're going to significantly increase our forage quality. Now it's getting harder and harder to do that because we're getting more rainfall in the spring. And that's a real challenge in terms of getting it cut on time. And a lot of times we delay cutting, and as we delay cutting, we decrease forage quality of our hay. One potential solution would be to use a baleage system where we would actually be able to cut hay one day, let it wilt a day, and then come back, bale it, and wrap it. So that reduces the number of days that we need from about 4 good curing days down to around 2 days. We can harvest a high quality forage. By doing that and cutting earlier than we normally do, we'll get a little bit less yield, but we're going to have a much higher forage quality. And we're going to get a second cutting. And most of our cool season grasses, if we cut late spring, early summer, we don't get a lot of regrowth on those stands. But if we cut early enough, we can put a little fertilizer on and get a nice leafy second cutting that we can make as dry hay when the curing conditions are a little bit better. Okay, I know nobody does this, but up here is something that really went wrong here. It's a bunch of hay bales in this picture that were just set out, no rings, no limited access to the hay bales, and they just made a complete mess out of this hay feeding situation. We really need to use some type of barrier between the animal and the hay bale. It could be a bale wagon, it could be a bale ring, it could be some type of a hay feeding system, but something that's a barrier between that animal. And ideally it would have slanted bars. And you're saying, well, why does that matter that it has slanted bars? It changes the animal's behavior. So if the bars were up and straight up and down, the animal could just pull its head right out. And when it pulls its head out, it usually has a mouthful of hay, which it drops half of on the ground. With the slanted bars, it's got to kind of turn its head and back out, and we tend to get less hay loss when we have slanted bars. There's a whole bunch of different feeder types on the market. The more complex they get, the more expensive they are, and the heavier they are, harder they are to move. Ideally, hay rings will be shielded at the bottom, which will help reduce wastage. And these cone feeders can significantly reduce wastage. They're either tapered or actually a cone. You know, if you're in a bale grazing situation or a situation where you're moving hay feeding points around, these are not a lot of fun to move. You'll probably have to do it with a tractor, but something like a poly ring, not as good, but much more of a pleasure to move than an old metal hay ring. So here's some best management practices for hay feeding. You want to choose a well-drained area. Match the hay in the animal class. So if you've got a bunch of lactating cows, you know, that have just calved in the fall, you probably want to feed them some of the better quality hay. And then as the lactation goes down, then we can start to feed some lower quality hay. Feed hay that's stored outside first, because that's going to deteriorate much faster. Hay under a roof, and it's not on wet soil, I mean, it's going to last a long time in a barn. When I was in Virginia, we were at a dairy farm, and a guy was running it for beef cattle, and there hadn't been dairy cows there for 20 years, and there were some hay bales up in the top of the barn that were over 20 years old. And I took some home and tested it, and it was still very high in quality, crude protein and total digestible nutrients. Now, vitamins degrade, but the energy in the crude protein was still good. Use hay rings or some type of barrier between the animal and the hay to reduce losses. And then don't put a whole bunch of hay out. A lot of times I'll see people go out and they'll set 2 or 3 bales in a hay ring, and generally that just turns into a big mess. It's better to kind of ration that hay out for a couple days at a time. And if you can do that, you're going to reduce hay losses, feeding losses, and get longer feeding days out of that same amount of hay. And don't be afraid to make mature animals that are in good condition and clean that hay up. Now, you have to be careful when you're working with young animals, right? Young growing animals or lactating animals. You don't want to force them too hard to clean things up, because they're still growing and they need that extra energy. And then move hay feeding points around. And when you do that, you're going to get a better distribution of nutrients within that grazing system. And this is just an example. This is some work that we're doing at the research station with the bale grazing study, where we actually have a hot wire and we limit access to the bales. Only enough hay for 2 to 3 days at a time. And then we put a ring around these new bales as we take this line down. So this is just an example of traditional versus a tapered feeding. When you use a cone feeder or a tapered feeder with shield on the bottom, we often can see reductions in hay losses of around 20%. So that's a significant loss a significant reduction in losses going to that feeder. Now it's harder to move that feeder around, so it would probably work best in a stationary system because you're probably going to have to use a tractor to move it around. So this is unrolling and hay processing. So, and this is the percent loss on here. So when we unroll hay, we had about a 12% loss. Not terrible. And the nice thing about unrolling hay is that we get a nice even distribution of that hay across the pasture surface. So that's kind of a benefit too. But we do have about a 12% loss. Now when we process that hay, so we grind it up and then put it out on the ground in the pasture, we had a significantly higher loss of dry matter. And these were both compared to processed in the bunk, which we would say was our control. So the reason that we think we have a higher loss with the processed hay is that a lot of the fines, remember in hay, the fine materials where most of the nutrition is. If we get really coarse material, that's going to be the stem material, that's going to be less. Those fines tend to fall out in processed hay on the soil surface and the animals can't get a hold of them. So that's going to tend to increase our losses. This was another study that was done in Canada that looked at a cone feeder compared to unrolling, compared to processing. So when they used a cone feeder, that was our control. When we unrolled, we had about a 4% increase in 4 to 5% increase in hay loss. And then when we processed that, we had an even larger increase in losses in this particular study and fed it on the ground. So just a few closing thoughts on this whole thing. Hay's expensive. It's an expensive part of beef cattle operations. Even if you don't write a single check for it, if you go back and sit down and really put the pencil to it, hay is going to be an expensive part of producing a calf every year. And we need to work in states, transition zone states like Kentucky, to increase the number of days that we're grazing and reduce the number of days that we're feeding hay. And if we do that, that's going to help keep us profitable. We need to work to improve hay quality. When we improve quality, we have less refusal and higher nutrient density in that hay, and that's going to help us have less hay in our system. We need to store hay under cover if possible. That's the ideal situation. If we don't store it under cover, then we need to follow those practices that we talked about, running the rows up and down slopes, leaving 3 to 4 feet between them, and so on. We need to make sure, if at all possible, that we break ground contact. If we break contact with the bottom of that bale in the ground, we're going to decrease hay losses in storage. And then match hay quality to animal class, feed hay in rings, move hay feeding points around. When we move hay feeding points around within grazing systems, we're capitalizing on the nutrients in that hay. We're using that as nutrients as fertilizer for our pastures. And then avoid feeding processed hay on the ground. If you're processing hay, make sure and feed it in a bunk if at all possible. Hay processing is, it involves a big tractor and some type of a chopper, bale shredder or implement. So there's a cost associated with that equipment also. So we have to be careful when we're making those equipment expenditures and cow-calf operations. Just mention our YouTube channel. This is called the KY Forage's YouTube channel, and it's got probably, maybe 400 videos on it that you can watch from meetings like this and other meetings from all around the state. If you missed our fall grazing conference, we had a really good fall grazing conference. Ron Gill from Texas talked about animal handling and grazing systems. Matt Isaacs from Hart County talked about his farm. We had Jason Thompson from Shelbyville talk about his farm. We had Greg Brand talk about optimizing grazing resources with mixed species grazing. Just a whole bunch of good talks. So if you missed that, you can go on there and watch those talks on a video form on this channel. You get to it just by simply Googling KY forages. So if you Google KY forages, it'll be the first thing that pops up. And I'll just mention one thing. There's two search bars on this page. There's one here. This search bar searches all of YouTube. If you go to the middle of the page, there's a little search bar right here. If you search that one, that just searches within this page if you were looking for something on the KY Forages YouTube channel. And the last resource that I just want to share with you is our Forages webpage. I think we've got one of the best in the country, and if you go to it, you can click on this blue button. It's the first thing you'll see. It's got all of our upcoming events, grazing workshops, grazing schools, fencing schools, grazing conferences, and so forth will all be underneath here when you click on this. We put out a monthly newsletter, and we do this religiously on the first of each month. So you can click on here and look at the newsletter, and you can click here and subscribe to the newsletter so it sends it to your email directly as a PDF file, if you'd like to get it that way. And then all of our information is organized underneath these 12 tiles on here. So if I want to know something about alfalfa, I just click on there. If I want to look at the variety trial, I click on the variety trial icon, and it brings up all the variety trial testing information. You get to this by simply Googling UKY forages, and it'll bring you right to this page. All right, is there any questions? And it doesn't have to be about hay feeding. If you have questions on pasture renovation or anything else, just feel free to ask them. All right. Thank you for your... Yeah.
You talked about hay refusal. Other than assume you produce better quality hay. If you have a little bit poorer quality hay, what steps can you take to reduce the refusal?
Well, number one would be you put something in between the animal and the hay, right? So a hay ring, some type of a feeder, and that will help with refusal. It won't solve the problem completely, but it will help with refusal. You can supplement hay with some, if it needs supplemented, according to your forage quality analysis, you can supplement it, and sometimes that supplementation will make the hay more digestible in the rumen. One of the other challenges with poor quality hay is getting enough in the animal. If we have really low quality hay, they simply can't eat enough of that hay to meet their nutrient requirements, and that's a real challenge. And that's going to require some supplementation to make sure they're meeting their protein and energy requirements. Is there any other questions? Thank you for your attention tonight.